we don't adequately meet the requirements to effectively combat any threats of money laundering and terrorist financing in South Africa.
South Africa's financial system is in danger of being grey-listed. What does this mean for the country and its economy? Well, joining me to discuss is Sanisha Packirisamy. She is an economist with Momentum Investments. Sanisha, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
All right, so we've heard a lot about grey listing, and it sounds very ominous, but what does that mean exactly for South Africa's financial system?
So unfortunately, a grey listing is actually bad news. It implies that we are a jurisdiction that have deficiencies in our legal regulatory systems and our criminal justice systems that are inadequate to actually combat financial crimes. And unfortunately, that's really frowned upon in the international landscape, and that can have major negative ramifications for the South African economy.
So this would include anti-money laundering efforts, anti-terrorism financing. Those are the kind of key concerns of this Financial Action Task Force, which is this regulatory body, this watchdog that basically supervises these kinds of things. Why is South Africa potentially being grey-listed? What are the timelines that we're looking at here? Because end of October is pretty important for us.
Sure. So it all actually began back in 2019 when the Financial Action Task Force released a mutual evaluation report on South Africa. So they did a site visit in South Africa. They put together this report and then actually sent it through to Cabinet in October of last year. So South Africa has actually been aware of the stakes for about a year now in terms of the deficiencies in our systems where we don't adequately meet the requirements to effectively combat any threats of money laundering and terrorist financing in South Africa.
All right. And what does this suggest about the state of South Africa's financial institutions, particularly our own regulatory bodies? There's the Financial Intelligence Center, National Treasury is involved here, SARS as well. The latter has had some pretty significant governance problems under the Tom Moyane era, and state capture, I think, is a big driver of this. So how are our financial regulatory bodies positioned to respond to this threat?
Unfortunately, we saw a period of degradation occurring in many of our crime combating institutions, some of our legal fraternities, in some instances, bodies such as the South African Revenue Services was also undermined and incapacitated over a period of time that occurred during the previous administration in South Africa. We are now starting to rectify those shortcomings, and it is taking some time to actually root out the tentacles of corruption that crept into many of South Africa's democratic institutions. So unfortunately, we're not sitting in a great position, particularly on the ability of South Africa to actually combat financial crimes and to go out and actually investigate and collect those assets that have been stolen. We do fall short in a number of aspects there. So in terms of the FATF grey listing, there is a component that relies on specific regulations that need to be put into place that will then strengthen our regulatory capacity to deal with money laundering and terrorist financing acts. But there's also an element of whether there is actually political willingness to resolve some of these issues and to strengthen our institutions of democracy so that we are in a much better position to combat these acts of terrorism and money laundering acts.
The instances of corruption and financial crimes are well documented in the Zondo Commission report, but not exclusively confined to the previous administration. Even the current president himself has some question marks over his Pala Pala farm and the large amounts of foreign currency that were found in his furniture there. So I think that even in terms of public perception, there's quite a few ongoing problems. But now, what about the response from government? I mean, are we seeing them taking this risk seriously enough?
It has seemed as though government waited until the last moment to put together some plans and to action them. But more recently, we've seen that National Treasury have put together a list of recommendations and handed that over to Cabinet. At the end of the day, it's not really only up to National Treasury to resolve the issue of a grey listing in South Africa and a potential grey listing to occur here, but it also relies on the regulators in South Africa, Parliament and Cabinet at large in South Africa, and some of our law enforcement agencies to ensure that we don't end up on the grey list. So while National Treasury have done their part, we actually have to see some political willingness taking place to actually resolve this issue before the February deadline of next year.
I mean, ultimately, this speaks to the state also of our criminal justice system, the ability of the state to enforce a number of these regulations. What is, in your view, the role that is playing, the breakdown in law and order and the overall perception of impunity that government officials can just get away with corruption? Do you think that that's factoring in here?
I think it does factor in large part, and I think it all really stems from the relative incapacitative the capacity that has been deteriorating in our law enforcement agencies, our crime combating agencies over the last couple of years. And unfortunately, with that taking place, South Africa sits in quite a difficult position in order to try and combat these crimes that are coming through. We've also seen that on a resource side, we're not actually seeing enough funding going to institutions like the National Prosecuting Authority. And so with a lack of resources and a lack of skilled employees, enough skilled employees, we are sitting with a bit of a deficit on that side of things.
So let's look at some international examples. I recall that Mauritius was once grey listed, and as a financial hub, a springboard into Africa, that was a pretty serious blow for them. They did manage to get off the grey list again, but that took quite a bit of time. Are there any lessons that we can learn from countries like Mauritius?
Definitely. So, I mean, there are, one of two paths that South Africa can take in this kind of environment. The one path is the less desirable one that Pakistan took. And between 2012 and 2015, we actually saw that but 1 to 2% of GDP was shaved off in terms of their growth prospects during that period of the grey listing that took place. And that's because Pakistan didn't really show any firm commitment or clear plan to work their way out of the grey listing status. On the other hand, and this is the other path that we're really hoping that South Africa can potentially follow if we are indeed grey listed, is one which Botswana, United Arab Emirates, Turkey and Mauritius followed. So even though they were grey listed, the period of grey listing was relatively short, and they had a very clear, credible strategy to work their way out of a grey listing. And that was actually seen as quite a positive from investors as well as the FATF. And as a result, they were actually taken off the grey list within quite a reasonably short period of time, with a limited impact on the financial segments of the economies that we were recently talking about.
All right. And in terms of the next steps, what should we be looking out for in terms of emerging risks on this particular topic?
So we'll be able to see what the FATF has decided, whether South Africa has indeed made enough progress or not within the next month. And then we have the plenary committee that takes place in February of 2023, at which point we will know whether we are going to be grey listed or not. I think from this point out, what's quite important to look out for is whether we see any movement on prosecutions for state capture, if we see any signs of a strengthening of South Africa's crime-fighting institutions and our law enforcement agencies. I think these are all factors that will stand in good stead for South Africa. We should also be able to see whether the government is saying anything around the grey listing and are showing a political willingness to resolve this issue in a relatively short period of time.
Sanisha Packirisamy, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. Do you think South Africa will be grey listed? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section. Also, if you would like to read a short report by Sanisha on the potential consequences for South Africa's financial system of a grey listing, you can do so by clicking on the link in the description below. My name is David Ansara. This is the Center for Risk Analysis. Until next time, take care.